Law number 2, the law of observation. Good communicators learn from great communicators. How does any person learn to communicate to an audience? Hall of Fame baseball player Yogi Berra, who became better known for his catchy sayings than he did for catching in games with the Yankees, said, "You can observe a lot by just watching. That is the essence of the law of observation. Good communicators learn from great communicators." The wisdom of watching. A few years ago, I came across a joke that I love. A fox, a wolf, and a bear went hunting, and each got a deer. A discussion followed about how to divide the spoils. The bear asked the wolf how he thought it should be done, and the wolf said, "Everyone should get one deer." Suddenly, the bear ate the wolf. Then the bear asked how the fox proposed to divvy things up. The fox offered the bear his deer and then said the bear ought to take the wolf's deer as well. "Where did you get such wisdom?" asked the bear. "From the wolf," replied the fox. "Like all communicators, I got my start by watching others speak and learning lessons from them." For me, it began early because my father was a preacher. Many Sundays as a child, I heard my dad communicate a sermon to the church. He spoke with great passion, and what a voice. He was from the generation before amplification. His voice was deep and he could project. My dad was an excellent speaker. I loved listening to him. His greatest strengths were his love for people, his personal credibility, and his great conviction. When I was in the 7th grade, Dad took me to hear Dr. Norman Vincent Peale speak at Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Columbus, Ohio, and that gave me another speaking model to observe and learn from. Dad was a student of Peale and his books, and he practiced the same power of positive thinking philosophy that Peale promoted. Peale was upbeat and encouraging, and he told a lot of stories when he spoke. Those qualities became something I identified as important to good communication. In the 50s, you might have been able to hear the President of the United States speak on the radio. But if you wanted an opportunity to hear other great speakers, you had to go see them live. In the Midwest in the 50s and 60s, my family would attend multi-day events called camp meetings where great preachers spoke one after another all day long. Old-fashioned speakers, such as Lawrence B. Hicks, would inspire people in the audience to stand to their feet and clap, shouting amen. I started seriously to study other speakers when I was 18. By then I knew speaking would be an essential part of my career. Because I would be preaching, I naturally started by observing preachers. I greatly admired the speaking of Charles Williams. He was a brilliant man with a photographic memory, a great orator who used continually flowery phrases. Because he was so skilled, I tried speaking his style. Oh, what a disaster. It was like wearing another man's clothes that didn't fit me. My mindset is more practical than philosophical, and I'd rather be funny than flowery. His way of speaking worked great for him, but not at all for me. When I was in my mid-20s, I got a chance to be a part of a speaking lineup in Vicksburg, Mississippi, with the legendary preacher named R.G. Lee. He was world-renowned for a message called Payday Someday that he had delivered more than 1,200 times. I had listened to a recording of him delivering that message when I was in college. I knew I was not in his league or the league of any of the other speakers on the program. In fact, when I met Dr. Lee before the event, I was so intimidated by him that I offered to give him my speaking time in the lineup. "No, son," he said. "I'm excited to hear you." When I spoke, he sat in the front row and encouraged me by listening. Afterward, he shook my hand and said, "That was a wonderful message. You have a great future. Can I take a picture with you?" I couldn't believe he wanted a photograph with me. It was something I would remember later when I met young leaders whom I wanted to encourage. After the photo was taken, he even offered to meet me the next morning for breakfast. Around the same time, I saw Paul Harvey speak, then Cabot Robert, a lawyer and a salesman, who had become a professional public speaker in his early 60s after he won the Golden Gavel Award from Toastmasters International. Robert went on to found the the National Speakers Association, and promoted keynote speaking as a profession. I also saw Zig Ziglar speak for the first time. He really opened my mind to greater possibilities when it came to communication. Zig made the most of his southern drawl. He recited poetry. He used humor. He moved around on the stage. He asked questions. He interacted with his audience. In the first message I saw him deliver, he used an old-fashioned hand pump as a prop on stage to help make his point. Like a lot of speakers in the 70s, I learned a lot from him and applied what I could to my speaking. By the time I moved to San Diego in 1981, I'd been speaking professionally for 12 years and had learned by observing hundreds of excellent communicators. By then, I thought I was becoming pretty good as a speaker, but it didn't take me long to figure out that the audiences in California were much different than those in the Midwest. I looked around and observed communicators such as Chuck Swindoll, Ray Stedman, Lloyd Ogilvy, and I immediately worked to modify my style, making it more informal, conversational, and relevant. Now, why do I bring up the names of all of those communicators, most of whom you've probably never heard of? To make a point, each of us will have a unique history of observing and learning from other communicators who are better than we are if we want to become good speakers. If you don't already have a history of watching and learning from great speakers, then you had better start now, because good communicators learn from great communicators. That's the law of observation. My stages of communication growth. In his 2015 letter to shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett wrote, "Much of what you become in life depends on whom you choose to admire and copy." Buffett attributes a lot of what he learned about managing companies to Tom Murphy, who was his mentor. Murphy built Capital Cities Communications into a telecommunications empire. In 1995, Murphy sold his company, then Capital Cities ABC, to Disney for approximately $19 billion. It took someone who knew how to become a billionaire to teach Buffett how to become a billionaire. Warren Buffett's statement is also true about communicating. Who you will become as a communicator depends on who you choose to admire and copy. As I look back now, I can see that my communication journey proceeded in 4 stages based on the people who I learned from and how I applied the lesson. Stage 1. I worked to learn the basics of good speaking where I was. My starting place was to look at others within my professional group, in my case within my denomination, and I learned by observing the best speakers. I watched them, learned from them, imitated what I thought would work for me. I spoke as often as I could to get practice. I tried different techniques, failed often, made adjustments, and improved. Stage 2. I learned more from great communicators outside my own world. As I became better, I widened my view. I looked at other communicators, professionals such as Zig Ziglar, to learn from them. I also began to observe great communicators from every field and profession. I'll discuss that more in this chapter. Number 3, as my audiences changed, I changed to keep connecting with them. The more experience I gained as a communicator, the more tuned in I became to my audience. As I expanded my speaking career, I had to keep learning new ways to connect with people. I will discuss this in great detail in Chapter 7 with the law of connecting. Stage number 4, I started teaching core principles that everyone could apply. In the 70s, I began teaching leadership. My audience was primarily church leaders. During the 80s and 90s, more and more business people attended my conferences to learn leadership, and I realized I could help more people if I shifted my speaking from church-specific leadership practices to universal leadership principles. This was when the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership was born. This shift meant that I had to reinvent myself again as a speaker, but it was well worth the effort to increase my influence and impact. Today, I continue to study communication so I can learn and grow. I will do that until the day I die. Why? First, because I love communication and want to know everything I can about it. And second, I know there are communicators out there who are better than I am and from whom I can learn. Third, audiences continue to change. If I'm not continuing to grow, one day I'll wake up and find myself irrelevant. I don't want that to happen. Better people make you better. If you have not already begun observing communicators and learning from them, then begin now. If you desire to be a good comedian, watch great comedians and learn from what they do. If you want to become a good trial lawyer, watch great attorneys speak in the courtroom. If you want to become a good classroom teacher, observe great teachers to gain a better understanding of how they teach. If you want to lead a business well, watch great business communicators cast vision, speak to their employees, or introduce their products. Start wherever you are and then practice your craft. Speak as often as you can and apply what you learn. Use whatever techniques you can imitate, borrow, or steal. Pay attention to what works and what doesn't. Adapt and figure out your own style using whatever works for you. If you start to become good as a communicator in your field, don't stop there. There's an old saying, if you are at the head of the class, you're in the wrong class. To continue growing as a speaker, expand your view of communicators from whom you learn. Watch highly skilled and experienced communicators in every field, and do it with intentionality, not casually. Each time you observe, ask yourself these questions. What did the communicator do to connect? Why did the introduction work so well? What made the structure work? What was the best moment? How did the communicator create it? What made the communication memorable? What was his or her best communication quality? How much was personality and how much was technique? What did he or she do that I can try? That's what I did. I studied communicators from different fields with different skills, and here are some of the things. Intimacy by observing Walter Cronkite. I grew up watching TV's Walter Cronkite, the anchor of CBS Evening News, which he headed from 1962 to 1981. Speaking like an honest fatherly figure, Cronkite was described as the most trusted man in America. During the years he was on the air, he shaped the opinions of the nation as he covered the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert F. Kennedy, the Apollo 11 moon landing, Watergate, and the Vietnam War. After Cronkite visited Vietnam and publicly stated the war could end only in a stalemate, President Lyndon Johnson said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Some believe this may have convinced Johnson not to run again. What made Cronkite so effective was his ability to create intimacy with viewers. Prior to his broadcast, people were used to getting news by reading newspapers, listening to the radio, hearing the stilted voices of newsreel narrators, or listening to politicians' speeches. But communication in the 60s was changing. Speaker, author, and coach Nick Morgan has written about the shift from public oratory in large spaces to intimate communication. He says, the growing use of microphones and speaker systems allowed for a more physically restrained approach to speaking before large audiences. But the real sea change in speaking styles came later. It is usually attributed to the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates in 1960, the first to be televised. But in fact, the switch happened in the 1950s as people forsook outdoor speeches and lecture halls for the comfort of the intimate little screen in the living room. Instead of watching a speaker address us from a distant stage, we invited Walter Cronkite into our homes. With the television screen framing his head and shoulders, Cronkite appeared to be talking to us from a few feet away. Within a space we usually reserved for talk about fairly personal matters with people we trust. The close personal contact, or the illusion of it at least, made us feel connected to Cronkite and other television figures. They became implicitly trustworthy in our minds. In this seemingly intimate space created by television, The old-fashioned kinesthetic approach to public speaking, the large gestures, the sweeping phrases, the grand conceits, was obviously out of place. What we needed instead, and what we got, was the personal conversation appropriate to the cozy environment. Over time, the illusion of physical closeness conveyed by television created in all audiences an expectation of intimacy, both spatial and emotional, from a speaker. Because of television, people expected communication to be more personal conversation. People craved less performance and more intimacy and warmth. As a communicator, I had to find a way to convey that. I've discovered that when I sit on a stool on stage and engage my audience in a more conversational tone, I can create a moment of personal connection with them, and I love that. The moment I sit, I can see the people in the audience get more relaxed. That action has transformed my communication. I learned the value of being natural by observing John F. Kennedy. A lot has been written about the 1960 debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. It was the first presidential debate to be televised, and many commentators assert that it changed American politics forever. I remember watching it on television when I was 13 years old and being captivated by Kennedy. While Nixon looked haggard and uncomfortable, Kennedy looked relaxed and youthful with his easy smile and natural delivery. His body language seemed to fit the moment, and his answers were just the right length. Even as a younger teenager, I was able to understand his points and follow his thinking. After Kennedy was elected president, like many young people in our country, I followed him and tried to listen to him communicate whenever I could. One of the things I heard him say that really spoke to me as a teenager was, "Everyone has a change the world speech in them." Wow! Those words planted a desire in my heart that has lasted 60 years. I've been committed to helping people and changing my world through my communication ever since. I learned about timing by observing E.V. Hill. E.V. Hill was a preacher in Los Angeles who had great positive influence in the African American community. He once invited me to preach in his church, which I considered a great honor. When I watched him preach, I saw that his sense of timing was impeccable. When he came to a very tender part of his message, he would pause. He slowly walked around the side of the lectern to gain connection with his audience, and he would let the auditorium become utterly quiet. Then, with a lowered voice, he would speak with great emotion and gentleness. Everyone was touched by what he said, because he said it in the right way at the right time. He became a model for me. When I physically move on stage, use pauses, and slow down to share something of importance, I use techniques that I observed from E.V. Hill. I learned to do it well, but not as effectively as he did it. He was the master. In the Law of Anticipation, Chapter 9, I will discuss how to use timing when speaking. I learned about clarity by observing Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan was serving as the 40th President of the United States, I used to love watching him speak. Often referred to as the great communicator, Reagan was able to connect with his audience because he chose words that were simple, compelling, and easy to understand. He communicated using simple wisdom and succinct, quotable phrases. For example, "We can't help everyone, but everyone can help someone." Peace is not absence of conflict, it's the ability to handle conflict by peaceful means. Recession is when a neighbor loses his job. Depression is when you lose yours. When you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat. Inflation is as violent as a mugger, as frightening as an armed robber, and as deadly as a hitman. I've always believed that a lot of trouble in the world would disappear if we were talking to each other instead of about each other. And what we all have heard from him, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Too many speakers try to impress their audience with how clever they are. Reagan tried to impact his audience with how simple his message was. I will discuss this more in The Law of Simplicity, Chapter 10. I learned about projecting confidence by observing Margaret Thatcher. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first woman to serve as British Prime Minister, a post that she held until 1990. Nicknamed the Iron Lady, she projected confidence and strength as a leader and a communicator, and she was not afraid to meet the opposition head-on. A chemist by education, she believed that she could come up with a solution to any problem. When she had won her place as Prime Minister, she said, "Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope." My wife Margaret and I had the privilege to be among a small group who spent an evening with the former Prime Minister. As she spoke to us, her confidence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. And during an opportunity for us to ask questions, her answers conveyed a strong sense of security. I was reminded of her recently when somebody came up to me after I was speaking and said, "When you speak, I feel that all is going to be well." That was such a great compliment because I admired that in Thatcher, and I have attempted to convey security to others when I speak. I learned about believability by observing John Wooden. During the early 2000s, I had the privilege of getting to meet Coach John Wooden a couple of times a year to ask questions and learn from him. I was his fan many decades before I ever got to meet him because he was such a great coach. Leading the basketball program at UCLA, he won 10 NCAA national championships in 12 years. More importantly, he invested in his players and changed their life. Coach Wooden's integrity, credibility, and how it impacted his players. Frequent and gratuitous praise removes the great value of a sincere compliment. Leaders who dole it out with little thought sacrifice a most powerful motivational ally, the pat on the back. For example, I avoided the phrase, "That's great." Instead, I would say, "Good, very good, that's getting better," or "That's the idea, now you're getting it, good." I kept in mind that how I conveyed information was often as important as the information itself. My tone was measured and my demeanor controlled, and I was honest. When I finally met John Wooden for the first time, one of my first impressions was his trustworthiness. He listened well, spoke carefully, and was sincere. Because I tend to believe the best in everyone and can be generous in my praise, I took note of his demeanor, and it reminded me not to over-communicate positive praise, but instead to follow his example. I learned about using rhythm by observing Martin Luther King Jr. One of the greatest speakers in my lifetime was Martin Luther King Jr., and when I was a teenager and he was campaigning for civil rights, I used to hear some of his speaking on the radio and on television. What struck me was the way King used rhythm and pauses to communicate motion and meaning to his audience. David Murray, the founder of Professional Speechwriters Association and the Executive Communication Council, has written about the musical quality of King's speaking. Most song lyrics look dead and dull on a page. In this I Have a Dream speech, the best prose is in the first 2/3, but the music starts when King departs from his text, or appears to. He stops talking and he begins to sing. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day, on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. If those words moved you just to hear me say them, it's because your imagination is putting them in Keen's voice, etched in your memory. But let someone say them in a tone-deaf verbal ramble, as we all did in grade school, and you realize how much Keen's rhythm and melody are what made those lines immortal. Delivery isn't all, but it's a lot. In fact, Keen's speech has been analyzed for rhythm and found to be just right to help audiences absorb and comprehend his message. I did not try to imitate Keen's style, but I learned from him to pay attention to rhythm of my speaking, to speed it up when I wanted to create energy and excitement, and to slow it down or stop altogether for emphasis. I will discuss this in greater depth in the Law of Change-Up, chapter 14. I learned about courage by observing Winston Churchill. Not all the communicators I learned from were active in my lifetime, nor have I heard all of them in person. As I studied World War II, I learned about the communication of Franklin D. Roosevelt, an excellent communicator whose "we have nothing to fear but fear itself" speech during the Depression, and Day of Infamy speech after the attack on Pearl Harbor moved the nation. But his counterpart across the pond during the war, Winston Churchill, was an even greater communicator. Perhaps no leader of the 20th century displayed as much courage in communicating as he did, or understood its importance more. He said courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because, as has been said, it is the quality which guarantees all others. When the entire British establishment sought to appease Hitler before the war, Churchill stood and spoke against the coming Nazi threat. He was proven correct when the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939. With Britain at war with Germany, Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1940. In his first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister, he delivered one of his most memorable speeches. "I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined this government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. This is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all cost. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. Under Churchill's leadership, Britain stood bravely against the Nazis as Germany bombed Britain, relentlessly killing 45,000 civilians in 18 months. He encouraged the people of his nation to be brave, keep calm, and carry on. Not only did he exemplify courage, he wanted every leader in wartime England to exhibit it. Journalist, historian, and author Erik Larson writes that Churchill taught the art of being fearless because he believed confidence and fearlessness were attitudes that could be adopted and taught by example. War Cabinet Secretary Edward Bridges said of Churchill, only he had the power to make the nation believe that it could win. But Churchill himself was more modest. I never gave them courage, he said. I was able to focus theirs. That's what great communicators do. They bring out the best in people and help them focus it so that they can accomplish great things. I've learned a different lesson from every great communicator that I've observed. But here's the one lesson I've learned from all of them. Great communicators always connect. Each communicator does it differently because there are so many different ways to do it. This is the most important lesson in communication. As you observe great communicators to learn from them, pay close attention to them and their audience while asking yourself these questions. When did the speaker connect? This is about timing. How did the speaker connect? This is about skill. How long did the speaker connect? This is about greatness. How can I connect like that speaker? This is about your potential. What are my connecting keys? This is about your technique. I'll teach you the keys to connecting in the Law of Connecting, Chapter 7. When you discover one of your connecting keys, you are on your way. And as soon as you do, practice it continually until it becomes a part of you. It must be natural to be effective. As you keep speaking, develop more connecting keys. The more you use to unlock your communication, the better you will connect. And that's one of the differences between good and great communicators. Good ones connect occasionally. Great ones connect continuously. If in the past you've been casual about learning communication by observing great communicators, I challenge you to become intentional about it. Go hear people speak in person. Watch TED Talks. Listen to podcasts. Study great speeches. You're living in a fortunate time when you have greater access to more great communicators than at any other time in human history. And do more than that. Travel. Walk in the footsteps of great communicators. Many times when visiting Washington, D.C., I have stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech and imagined the National Mall filled with people who were inspired to have hope. I've been on many other field trips to places where communicators touch lives. I have visited the bunker where Winston Churchill discussed England's darkest hours. I have read the speaking notes of Ronald Reagan in his presidential library. I have stood in the pulpit of the great transformational leader John Wesley. I have talked with Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square after he delivered a message. I have sat with Billy Graham and talked about speaking to stadium crowds. I have interviewed Maya Angelou in a green room before we spoke. I have knelt and asked great communicators to pray over me. Why have I done these things, and why do I continue to do them? Because I want to make a difference, and I know speaking is one of the ways I can do that. The better I become at communication, the greater positive difference I can make. Good communicators are not born being able to speak. A Chinese proverb says, "To know the road ahead, ask those coming back." If you want to become a good communicator, you need to learn from those who've gone ahead of you. Good communicators learn from great communicators. That's the law of observation.